If we can hold Chattanooga and East Tennessee, I think the rebellion must dwindle and die.
Abraham Lincoln, October 1863.
Well, the fort sort of hangs over Knoxville like a ghost. I mean, everybody says Fort Sanders. What is Fort Sanders? What was Fort Sanders?
Almost forgotten now, Fort Sanders was the site of a brief but crucial battle in the struggle to preserve the Union.
I don't think that anybody ever really knew where the fort was. I think it was always a guess.
All across Tennessee, there are monuments to the Civil War, battles won and lives lost, American blood on American soil. These simple markers commemorating the Battle of Fort Sanders stand on 17th Street in Knoxville, Tennessee. The fort is gone, and yet the name still lingers in Knoxville's neighborhoods and history. In 2015, 150 years after the end of the Civil War, the city started planning a celebration to mark the sesquicentennial, and that celebration would include the battle at Fort Sanders.
We started planting trees and doing some other things, and I thought when we were doing that, well, you know, why don't we do a historic walking tour around the fort location?
Several civic groups worked together to design an historic walking tour around the area where Fort Sanders once stood. A series of historic markers would tell the story of the great battle. The groups presented their plans to Knoxville's city engineers for approval.
But they told me that I had not prepared enough conclusive information as to the location of the fort for them to justify recommending an $80,000 budget for the project.
The suspected location of the fort was based on the book Divided Loyalties by highly respected author Digby Seymour. His book continues to be regarded as one of the premier books on the Civil War in East Tennessee. But the city engineers wanted more proof for the actual location of the battle.
And it was sort of unbelievable to me that it was wrong, but I was willing to go to the archives and look again to prove that 60-year-old information was correct.
Instead, Terry Faulkner uncovered a mystery that would take years to solve.
After studying photographs and the vertical files, newspaper articles, microfiche, I found that the engineers were right, that the fort was not located on the proper site. In this photograph that was taken
Surprised and now curious, Terry Faulkner and archaeologist Dr. Charles Faulkner embarked on a search to unearth the Battle of Fort Sanders.
And so that began the many years of measuring and photographing and geological testing and archaeology that we did subsequently. While looking through the archives, I discovered where the fort actually was located.
1863 was brutally cold. Years of civil war had left Knoxville and East Tennessee suffering and bitterly divided. In 4 years of conflict, only one military battle was fought here. It was small by comparison to the major battles at Chattanooga or Gettysburg, but Fort Sanders was crucial to the war. Knoxville was a strategic bridgehead, a military depot known as the Keep of East Tennessee, filled with valuable natural resources critical to the war, and it had the rail lines to transport men, arms, and material.
And the railroad was of crucial importance. It moved troops and supplies up and down from Virginia into the deep south, at least as far as Atlanta.
In a deeply Confederate state, East Tennessee stood apart. When Tennessee voted to secede from the Union, 2/3 of the people in East Tennessee voted to remain loyal to the North. And yet, in June of 1861, Tennessee joined the Confederate States. It was the last state to leave the Union.
And as soon as the war got started, East Tennessee was occupied militarily by the Confederates, and that meant we were all in this mess together at that point.
But the deep divisions remained. separating neighbors and splitting families. Loyalties erupted in anger and even violence. Fierce Confederate sympathizer Ellen House boasted she could kill a Yankee and not a muscle quiver. And many Union loyalists, like Parson William Brownlow, were jailed for treason.
And East Tennessee was under the thumb of the Confederate Army from the beginning of the war until mid-1863. So there was a long period when the Confederates were sort of firmly in the saddle in this region.
Across the South, Civil War forts were built with walls of dirt and mud. In 1863, Confederate General Danville Ledbetter began constructing a rough earthen fort designed to defend Knoxville.
Then in the fall of 1863, the Union Army decided that they wanted to recapture Knoxville. And so they sent General Burnside down. He was in Kentucky.
As the Union Army under General Ambrose Burnside advanced, the Confederate Army retreated. On September 3, 1863, General Burnside rode into Knoxville. Once again, East Tennessee belonged to the Union.
There's a famous illustration in Harper's of the Union people thronging the streets of Knoxville and throwing their hats in the air, and all the Union people bringing their U.S. flags out from hiding and hanging them in the street.
Now, Union Army engineer Captain Orlando Poe worked feverishly to reinforce the fort's defenses.
And he had a huge job to try to take the rough beginnings of a fort and turn it into something that was easily defensible, and to get it done between September and November.
Similar to other forts of this era, Fort Sanders was a massive earthen structure. The 15-foot-high walls built with sloping mud sides had bastions jutting out to provide maximum visibility for rifles and cannons.
From what I read, I think they conscripted every person they could lay their hands on to go dig. I mean, this was hard physical labor to dig ditches and pile up dirt and do, the necessary work for construction.
Poe described Fort Sanders as a bastioned earthwork built on an irregular quadrilateral. He ordered a ditch 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep dug along the western side and tightened his defenses by stringing telegraph wires between stumps. Captain Poe described the fort as built on the western slope of the hill, the military crest. This gave Union soldiers a clear view of Confederate General James Longstreet's forces advancing from the west. Union cavalry officer William P. Sanders clashed with Longstreet's army to the west of the city. Then, with the Confederates at his heels, Sanders started a slow, calculated retreat, giving the Union Army the critical time needed to strengthen the fort.
It was the extra time they bought that allowed the battle, when it finally came, to be successfully prosecuted on the Union side. It was disastrous for the Confederates.
When Sanders rode out to rally his troops, he was killed by a Confederate sharpshooter. The fort was named in his honor.
It was one of the coldest winters on record, 30 below zero. They said that soldiers who were on guard in the Confederate Army, at least, froze to death standing with their rifles. It was that cold.
But the freezing cold didn't stop General James Longstreet. As the sun rose on November 29, 1863, Longstreet attacked.
We was ordered not to fire until they had come up close to our works. All at once, 1,000 triggers was touched. The whole regiment fell.
William H. Chapman, Union soldier.
The Union Army had poured water down the slope where they knew where they were going to attack. They knew they were going to attack the west wall and the northwest bastion. They poured water down there, forming ice on that, and they fell into this ditch. It wasn't 2 to 3 feet deep. It was like 8 to 10 feet deep, and they couldn't get out. One of the artillerymen in the fort made hand grenades out of artillery shells and had timers on them and threw them over the wall down where these guys were.
The battle was brief but long enough. The Confederates suffered over 800 casualties, while the Union lost 13 soldiers.
The battle lasted approximately 20 minutes, and they called a truce and allowed the Confederates to collect the bodies and the wounded. And then Longstreet decided not to attempt another attack.
The roaring of our cannons made the earth tremble beneath our feet, but thank God our blood-stained banner waves over Knoxville.
William H. Chapman. The battle was over, but the Civil War still raged. General Davis Tilson took over the job of strengthening the fort, and he sketched this topographical map showing Fort Sanders. General Tilson would also recruit the 1st U.S. Heavy Artillery Regiment of African American soldiers. A view of Knoxville taken in March 1864 shows Fort Sanders and the desolate landscape.
They said East Tennessee is bleeding from every pore. It was a very, very difficult time to rebuild society.
Tennessee had been the last state to leave the Union. At the end of the war, it was the first state to return. Now Knoxville set its sights on the future and promoted itself as a progressive city of the South. As the city grew to the west, the land the fort was built on became prime real estate, making way for a growing population. And eventually the fort was buried under the expanding town. In 1890, Knoxville hosted the Blue and the Gray reunion, welcoming veterans from both sides of the conflict. One of the attendees was General James Longstreet, who came back to Knoxville for the first time since the Civil War. The reunion held on the site of Fort Sanders was captured in this 1890 photograph.
We follow the route of the attack up the...
When Terry Faulkner began her search for the location of Fort Sanders, she began here.
Well, the most important photograph was one that was at the McClung collection, and it was of the 1890 reunion of the veterans who had called the Blue-Gray reunion. It was one of the first reunions of veterans that both sides were invited. At that time, most of the walls were still there in the bastions, and that was the first photograph that we began to study extensively.
This 1890 photograph shows the enormous reunion tent, the southwest bastion, 18th Street and 17th Street.
At the end of the fort, on the eastern end of the fort, they built a house in 1890. This is the Harrison House. This photograph was made in 1890.
And because of one single house that was located in it, we were able to compare that to a 1917 Sanborn map, which was an insurance map that was made of all areas of the cities that had every outbuilding, etc. on it, that the house was on the east side of 17th Street. So we knew at that point that the remainder of the fort, the mass of the fort, was west of 17th.
Another photograph taken in March 1864, just months after the battle, shows U.S. Army engineers Orlando Poe and Orville Babcock posed near the ditch on the west side of the fort.
And the photograph also shows the edge of a sinkhole that, according to a Confederate officer, was a stone's throw from the fort, from the northwest bastion. And if they had known this, they would have put sharpshooters in there and they might have won the battle, but they didn't.
That sinkhole still existed on 18th Street well into 2019 when it was finally covered up by new construction.
One of the photographs showed the two soldiers standing by a sinkhole. That's this sinkhole that's behind me, and there's no indication of any other sinkholes in the area that appear on topographic maps or any other places that I have seen. So yes, this is most likely the same sinkhole.
Aerial photographs taken in 1922 show not only the locations of homes, but also remnants of Fort Sanders and the nearby sinkhole.
You can see the open trench, and you can see that somebody has planted shrubs in part of the trench, and then they left a large part of it open and outlined it with rocks. You could see a lot of evidence of the Northwest Bastion in this photograph.
The Faulkners spent 8 years researching archives, poring over photographs, and digging for other evidence. They walked the neighborhood looking for clues, sidewalks that had collapsed, unnatural mounds of earth, and streets that ended abruptly.
There are some specific things, some small, specific, identifiable pieces of it that are still able to be identified by an archaeologist like Dr. Faulkner, that the average person would just pass by and be totally oblivious to.
The most evidence was actually at the Ronald McDonald House. From there down to 18th Street, you could actually see the rise there where the Southwest Bastion had been.
They carefully excavated by hand and took core samples from areas they were certain had been inside the fort. When a private home on 18th Street was undergoing renovation, the team of archaeologists took soil samples and gathered evidence of what they believed was an embrasure once surrounding a Civil War cannon.
We employed a technology called X-ray diffraction to look at the sample. Very fine-grained silica. Well, it's pure silica, which is unusual.
If you look at one of the photographs in particular, it's a gun emplacement or an embrasure. And here are the sandbags which are holding up the side walls of this.
The Faulkners believed sandbags, which were typically used around embrasures during the Civil War, might have been filled with pure silica sand available from a nearby glass factory.
Well, it told us that there were cannons in those locations where we found the silica sands, and we also have that photograph of the Northwest Bastion where the white sand is coming down out of the embrasure, and there are bags, what we think certainly are bags that are laying at the bottom of this down in the ditch.
Today, the Fort Sanders area is still prime real estate.
This alley went through the center of the fort, of the interior of the fort, and it went east-west through the interior.
When new construction along the alley exposed layers of soil, the Faulkners hurried to excavate.
We identified a buried fort level. We found a hard asphalt black surface, and as we uncovered that, I thought, this is some kind of road surface. We think it is either from 1864 or it was built in 1890 when the town hosted the Blue Grave Reunion.
The archaeology team continued to focus on 18th Street and on a slumping sidewalk and driveway.
I'm standing towards the west wall of the fort and in an alley that went right through the middle of the fort this way. And I started looking at the 1922 aerial. And here was this house in it, and here was the trench for the Northwest Bastion, which joined the west wall right here. That's why that alley is caving in, because once you fill in, this trench was approximately 12 feet wide, 10 feet deep. Once you fill in something, which they did probably in the 20s, and it's going to subside. So we decided that we needed to remote sense and see if we could determine if this trench was still underneath this and it could be proved.
They used ground-penetrating radar in 3 locations, which they'd matched with known landmarks.
And so what we have here is a white column. And then we have a house that was built in 1914. The Roddy House is right here.
And so these 2 are the ones that I used to georeference this map. The map fits pretty well. We're looking at something that is a linear feature.
Would you say, Howard, that we have picked up a part of the Civil War trench that's seen in the 1922 area photograph?
That is a good question. It does seem about the right dimensions for that.
Okay.
If we look at this again, here's where that spot is, where the trench would be.
So do you think that's the turn in the bastion?
I think it's the turn in the bastion. Given all these things, this trench should be right about here. And so we go look right about there for this trench, and we found it. It was kind of nice. But everything seems to fit: the size, the length, the width, the potential depth, all seem to fit the record of what the fort was. It is a piece of the puzzle.
So this would have been an area that they were tossing shells in at the Confederate attackers, which exploded and created quite a horrible scene. What I sought out to prove was that the attack on Fort Sanders took place on 17th Street. And what I ended up proving was that the attack took place on 18th Street.
I think it's not a guess now. I mean, we knew we were in the right general neighborhood. The question is exactly where was it? And with the photographic evidence and the archaeological evidence, I think we can say with some degree of certainty, we now know where it was.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the west end of the fort was down on 18th Street.
There is a Daughters of the Confederacy memorial marker on 17th Street, and it intimates that the Confederate attack took place on 17th Street. But the actual battle took place on 18th Street at the West Wall, and then we spent all the following years doing scientific research to prove that.
I think history-minded people, particularly, as we in the East Tennessee Historical Society like to say, we want to go to the place and stand on the spot. That's how you really connect with history. But to me, it's very important to the history of Knoxville that site be honored. But that's really where the battle was fought.
The Battle of Fort Sanders, where Union and Confederate soldiers fought and died, and where Knoxville held for the Union.
There's a lot of history left here, and it's all around us. I mean, you know, that it's part of the fabric of the place, but you have to dig pretty deep to get to find those spots. And that fort site is one of them.